I'm Father David, and this is Friar Time. Today, we enter a conversation that is as complex as it is personal, one that touches medicine, law, identity, politics, and most of all, of course, people, transgender issues. Across our country, legislation is being introduced, challenged, and defended. States are banning or restricting gender affirming care for children and for teens. In April of 2021, Arkansas became the first state to ban gender affirming medical treatment, with other states following that. Texas, however, took a different tack. Earlier this year, the governor ordered the Department of Family and Protective Services to classify medical treatments for transgender adolescents, such as puberty blockers and hormone injections, as child abuse, and to investigate parents seeking these treatments for their children. Never mind that mainstream medical organizations like American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, and the American Academy of Pediatrics oppose these efforts to block qualified professionals from treating gender dysphoria in children and in adolescents. Families, doctors, and religious leaders are caught in a storm of questions. What's right? What's safe? What's moral? And how do we protect our children, their bodies, their minds, and their souls? This isn't just a political or medical issue, it's about real lives, young people trying to find peace in who they are, parents trying to love their children well, and a society that's struggling to understand. With us today is Dr. Jack Drescher, a medical doctor and a clinical professor of psychiatry at Columbia University and a distinguished life fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. An openly gay psychiatrist, Dr. Drescher has also served on the World Health Organization's work group revising sexual and gender diagnoses. We're here to ask the deeper questions, but always with compassion, with courage, and our Franciscan tradition guiding us. We're here to listen, not label, to walk with, not push away. This is Friar Time. Let's start talking. Welcome, Dr. Drescher. Thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate it. Um, let's begin with the most basic of the questions for this conversation. What does it mean to be transgender?
Well, first, let me thank you for inviting me. I think this is a very important subject, which most people don't know a lot about. And sometimes people are very embarrassed to ask questions
Right.
because they don't know that much about it. So, one of the things that I've been trying to help my professional organizations do is try and educate both professionals and the general public about a very small patient population that's getting a lot of media attention.
Um,
So, to your question, what does transgender mean? Well, actually, it can have lots of different meanings because lots of people may use the word in a different way. But basically, the word transgender comes from a community of people. It's a word that they use to label themselves, not dissimilar to what happened to gay people who used to be called homosexuals by the medical establishment. But when they decided to name themselves, they called themselves gay and lesbian.
right.
So transgender people have named themselves as we are people who our feelings about our mind and our bodies, they don't match in the way most people's do, because most people are not transgender.
Uh-huh.
But some people are, and that means that they feel like there's a mismatch between whether they identify as a male or a female or even something not male or female, and their bodies.
So it's a feeling of disassociation almost?
No, it's not. Well, I mean, they don't feel connected. That many of them, not all of them, but many of them do not like their bodies that they're born with. Their bodies feel uncomfortable to them. That takes us out of the realm of transgender, which is a community term, into the psychiatric, which is I know was going to be your next question.
Right, yes. So I've read that many trans adults suffer from gender dysphoria. So, what exactly is gender dysphoria? How is it diagnosed in children or adolescents? And is it simply a medical term, or does it carry a deeper human, spiritual dimension too?
Well, I would say that gender dysphoria is both a medical and a scientific term. It's not, I don't think it comes from religion or spirituality. The term has been around for a long time, and it really refers to this feeling that, my body and my gender do not feel like they match each other.
Mhm.
And psychiatry has been like labeling people like this for since the 1800s. The first book that was a book from 1886 called Psychopathia Sexualis, which, by the way, was written off. Lots of parts were written in Latin so that only doctors and priests
Oh,
could
really?
understand it. And it was by a German psychiatrist named Richard von Krafft-Ebing, and he described people back then who were born to one gender, but they were living as the other. But in those days, they called everything homosexuality. And it was only really until the 20th century that people started making distinctions between what we today think of as a sexual orientation and a gender identity. And really the first time the word gender identity appears in a medical book is 1962.
Oh,
So these distinctions really took a long time, and I can tell you that most people don't really understand the distinctions even among the professions. So that's really a problem right now. So gender dysphoria. In 2008, the American Psychiatric Association decided to revise its diagnostic manual, which is called the DSM. The DSM has been around since 1952 and gets revised periodically.
and this for our audience, this is basically a manual of a variety of human behaviors.
Yes, these are the official diagnoses that American psychiatry and much of the world also recognizes too. But the DSM is the American Psychiatric Association's, manual, where if you were to see a psychiatrist, they might, be thinking about what your diagnosis was based on what's written in
Mhm.
this very thick book. And we're now at DSM-5 TR, which means we're the fifth version, and it's the text revision. So the first one came out, DSM-5 came out in 2013, and the revision just came out in 2022. And the DSM-5 was the first one to call the diagnosis gender dysphoria.
Oh,
Prior to that, it used to be called gender identity disorder, or it was called transsexualism in the DSM-3, for example, back in 1980. So the names have changed with time as more research is going on and people have tried to understand this phenomenon.
so as we heard in our opening, there are many states that are stepping into this medical arena now with new targets, laws targeting gender affirming care. So, what exactly is gender affirming care for minors, and why would we say that the mainstream medical organizations, such like AMA, APP, support it while states are banning it?
Well, it's a great question. I'll start by saying this, that I'm not a child or adolescent psychiatrist myself, and I only became interested in learning more about the subject in 2008. Prior to that, I was writing a lot about the areas of homosexuality, which has some intersection with issues around gender. So I was appointed to work on the revision of the DSM, the
Oh,
Diagnostic Manual, in 2008. And there was a big brouhaha about whether the diagnoses should be in the manual at all. So historically, you may know, in 1973, the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from the DSM-2.
right.
And so when we were revising DSM-5, the first revision done in the modern internet age, everybody was weighing in on whether these diagnoses should even be in the manual at all. And so this diagnosis, we decided to change the name from gender identity disorder because we want, which is a stigmatizing term, to
Disorder.
something called gender dysphoria. And in gender dysphoria, it refers to this feeling that there's an incongruence between who I feel myself to be and what my body says I am. And this is really hard for most people to understand because until you've met a person who feels this, and I would say this even myself, the first patients I met back in the 1990s, I was trying to sort of put myself in their shoes because
Right.
I'm not gender dysphoric myself. And this is a real thing. And many people think unfortunately, many people always think it's something else, and you can just talk people out of it. But really, it's really very hard to do that. So over the years, and people have been treating people for this condition for about 100 years. The first surgeries that were done on adults were done in the 1930s in Europe. And medication treatments only started in the 1940s when hormones became available, and puberty blocking, which is very controversial, only started for these kids. Well, puberty blocking began for other kinds of kids in the 1980s and for gender dysphoric kids in the 1990s. So when people use the word gender affirming care, they usually mean we accept the possibility that what you're feeling is real, and that we recognize that you're uncomfortable in your body, and let us do what we can to make you feel more comfortable. Now, for some people, gender affirming care simply might be a name change.
Oh,
So for some people, it might just be a pronoun change. And some people, it might just be being able to dress in the clothing that feel more appropriate to their gender. So these are things that we call social transitions. And so that would be one example of, the least invasive kind of gender affirming care, because it doesn't involve any medical or surgical
right.
intervention. I also want to underline, and I probably will wind up saying several times in our talk, nobody does surgery on kids usually who have gender dysphoria. That would be, if that happened, it would be very rare. It's a very unusual thing for that to happen. But there are medication treatments that do occur, and that could involve, for a child, for example, who's 12 years old, who, let us say, since the age of 3, was birth assigned male, what people call biological male. Unfortunately, we actually don't know where the biology of gender lies. So the current term is birth assigned male. And that child has felt female since age 3. And that child is approaching 12 years old, and puberty is going to start. And so sometimes for some of those kids, not all of them, but for some of those kids, they might change their mind when they're 14 or 15, but they might not. And so the Dutch in the 1990s came up with a protocol to slow down puberty, which had already been existed. There's a condition which is called precocious puberty. It's another medical condition. So there's sometimes children, usually girls, who at the age of 7 or 8 might start entering puberty. And everybody thinks this is a bad idea, both psychologically, socially, and physiologically. So since 1981, these medications called puberty blockers have been available for these children. And these medicines are now being used for about 45 years, very safely for these children. And there is no law against them in any state banning puberty blockers for kids with precocious puberty. But here it's become controversial because, again, people don't think that this is a real thing, and therefore you shouldn't be doing it.
Well, I mean, I would imagine our audience is probably thinking the same thing, which I would imagine some people in our society would be thinking is, how does a 3-year-old show signs of gender dysphoria?
Well, a 3-year-old will insist to their parents. Let's start with someone let's start with Johnny.
Okay.
Okay, Johnny has been
So Johnny's
Johnny was designated
as
male
male.
at birth by his genitals, which
Uh-huh.
is how we usually make the decision.
Right.
And at age 3, starts saying, that I'm a girl. You know, some children actually say, "No, I'm not a boy, I'm a girl."
Mm,
Or that these are and this is very rare. This is not what we call a gender atypical child. This is a child who drives the parents, the family, and the schools a little bit crazy,
right.
because they're very, very insistent. And they are, and again, most clinicians have never seen a case of this. Most people don't know anybody who's done this, who has who's a family member or neighbor. But this is very real, very powerful. Just because a boy wants to play with a Barbie doll doesn't mean they have gender
Right.
dysphoria. That's
Right.
that's not the same thing. This
Yeah.
is really, when you see it, the experts who work in this area, this is really what they see all the time, and it happens. And so this child may continue through, their childhood, feeling like they're a girl. There would be no medication treatment. Some places will do a social transition, and they will allow the child to go to school as a girl, and everybody knows the child is a girl. But then puberty comes along, and this child now has the problem that with a male puberty, they would get a growth in their penis, they would get an Adam's apple, they might get a beard growing, a deepening of their voice. They don't want any of these things to happen to them. And so the whole idea of the puberty blockage is to prevent this child from developing into an adult male body.
And this is like a temporary fix, so to
And it
speak?
could be a temporary fix. So, for example, some children, like So the child might enter puberty at 12 and change their mind at 14. That does happen occasionally. And so it's a win-win situation depending whichever direction the child goes, because if they change their mind, they'll just have a delayed onset puberty.
Uh-huh.
And if they don't change their mind, they won't develop what we call secondary sex characteristics, that is, adult male or female characteristics, which then require more medication and more surgical treatments when they become older as adults.
I mean, you can see where this could get very confusing for
It's
the
so
average
it's
person
very confusing,
listening to all this. Yeah.
there's so much information, and this is really why it's so unfortunate that it's become a politicized issue, because
Mhm.
what's really happened is, since most people don't understand it, people have been made to be afraid of this.
Right. Mhm.
People are being said, "This is something you should worry about." And for some reason, it's only happened in states with Republican legislatures.
Mm.
So it's become a political issue
Yeah,
rather than a
yeah.
medical issue.
So, do you believe that children and teenagers are capable of making these kinds of transitioning decisions, or that they would have legitimate concerns about irreversible treatments?
This is a great question, and the answer really depends on who you talk to.
Mhm.
So, for example, there was a lawsuit against the clinic in England, the Tavistock Clinic, in which the question was just that, whether or not a child is capable of making a competent decision for that kind of thing. And that court ruled that only children 16 or older could be competent, but younger than that, they could not. But see, that kind of is besides the point, because it's very rare that a child is making this decision on their own. Almost every responsible clinic involves the parents and the family and the caretakers in the
True.
decision-making process. So, I once got a call from a Fox News reporter, from I think from Oregon. He goes, "Do you know in Oregon that it's possible for a 15-year-old to get a sex change operation without their parents' permission?" I said, "Do you know a surgeon who would do a sex change operation without the parents' permission?" That's besides the point.
Oh,
But no, it is the point. The reality is that nobody is doing anything to children without the permission of their parents.
there's a strong reaction in some faith communities
Yes.
towards the transgender identity and transgender people. How do you believe that we, as Catholic Christians, Franciscans, should approach transgender individuals, especially youth, with both pastoral care and moral clarity also?
Well, I'm an educator at heart. I'm a professor at two universities here in New York, and I lecture here in New York and all around the world, thanks for Zoom as well. So, and as I said, I'm not a child and adolescent psychiatrist, so I don't treat these kids myself. I did everything in my power to learn as much about it as I could. When I got involved in this issue, I said, I have a collaborator, Dr. William Vine. He and I have written lots of textbook chapters together. And when we don't understand something, we like, well, how can we learn more about it? So back in 2012, we went out to a bunch of clinics and we said, tell us what you do. Explain to us what's going on here.
Mhm.
We published those 5 clinics that responded to us. They explained to us what they did. And then we've kind of sorted through what they told us to try and put together a list of what we know and what we don't know. So, in terms of religious and spiritual communities, your job is not to have opinions until you know more about it. I mean, everybody has an opinion about it.
Mhm.
My personal opinion is you're really not qualified to express your opinion if you haven't tried at least to learn to more about it from reliable sources, because of course there's a lot of misinformation on all subjects out
Right,
there as well.
right. I think we would have. I know that in terms of the LGBTQ plus community, the Catholic Church encourages us to approach every single person as with all the dignity that God created them to be, and so it's almost like, aside from any issue, these are people made in the image and likeness of God, and that's how we approach them. I think part of sometimes what gets uh, involved in here is the moral issues. And I think a lot of it is what you're saying, doctor, is about the fear that people have about these are children, how can they make these kinds of decisions?
And
And like you're saying, it's not happening.
I don't think the fear is unjustified, but people don't know that children are not making the decisions without their parents.
Right.
And so unfortunately, then what happens is one of your advanced questions is the demonization of the parents.
You're right.
So, the states that would like to say that if you're a parent who would actually do this to your child, you must be practicing child abuse. So this is a really good example of politicians getting in the middle of clinical decisions between doctors, families, and children who are struggling with a really complicated subject, which was already complicated enough before it became a political issue.
Uh-huh. So would you say, is it ethical or is it just to classify gender affirming care, as you just said, as child abuse, particularly when parents and doctors are trying to alleviate the suffering of the child?
No, it's child abuse to deny a child that would benefit from the treatment
Mm,
access to the treatment, which is really what's happening now. So we're now beginning to hear the stories of families that are leaving red states to move to blue states because blue states are trying to protect access to care in
uh,
the face of what's going on now in the federal government.
some critics point to this sudden rise in transgender identity among youth, and they worry about this as part of a cultural influence.
Mhm.
So, are we seeing a genuine shift in understanding gender, or could this be some sort of social trend that is masking other mental health concerns like anxiety, like autism,
Mhm.
something like that?
Great question, and the answer is nobody knows. So I like to point out that I'm an expert who's able to say in front of an audience, we don't know, that we don't know a lot the answer to those questions. So depending on who you talk to, some people say it's the internet. That the exposure to the internet is introducing ideas into children's heads that they wouldn't otherwise have had if they were kept locked away in their Rapunzel's castle.
Hmm.
But I have a colleague who's a child and adolescent psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who worked in an affluent neighborhood in Connecticut, in Westchester, and saw a lot of teens. And he did a very interesting presentation that many adolescents have found that talking about gender issues is not unlike the ways that should adolescents of previous generations would drive their parents crazy by growing their hair long,
Oh,
or wearing mohawks. That gender is a provocation for some, that the kids are better at it. And I often do consultations, parents from around the country sometimes. Perhaps a child has come out to them announcing some type of gender issue and they wanted someone to explain, what's going on. And I have to say, this is not a good thing that your 15-year-old knows more about the subject than you do. And so again, always my advice to the parents is, unfortunately, you now have to educate yourself on a subject that you never wanted to know anything about. You may still not want to know anything about, but your child has given you no choice. And in some ways, all the laws that we're seeing passing are efforts to sort of render the whole subject invisible,
yeah,
to stop the talking, not to have books about it, not to have drag queen storybook hour,
yeah.
where people are exposed to ideas that the parents are uncomfortable about.
Hmm.
I'll say this: there are parents who think that kids cannot understand these issues. Kids can understand it great because parents don't understand the issues. They don't know how to explain it to their children. And that's really the problem.
Uh-huh. That's a good point. So there are voices who have of those who have detransitioned, who speak of regret. I think we touched on that earlier.
Mhm.
What role then should stories of detransitioning play in this sort of public debate? Because it seems like one side or the other can grab that story and say, "Well, see, you did this, and now you're
Right.
changing your mind." How should they be honored without dismissing the
Well, everybody should be honored, but again, the issue of detransition has again become depoliticized. We saw a similar kind of issue 20 years ago when the country was arguing about whether or not we should have gay marriage, for example. So there were people who called themselves ex-gays,
Mhm.
and they would appear at legislative hearings about whether or not the state should have gay marriage, and someone who said, I used to be gay, I'm not gay anymore, therefore you shouldn't give gay people any rights because
Uh-huh.
it's not who people intrinsically are. I changed. So the detransitioner phenomenon is tragic, of course, but there are a couple of studies already out there that what we call qualitative studies, meaning that they ask people deep questions about, with multiple essay kinds of answers. And what these studies are showing is that the reasons people change their mind are multiple. Some people change their mind even though they still have gender dysphoria, for example, but they say they experienced so much discrimination after the transition that they didn't want to stay transition, or their families didn't approve of it. They didn't, they got feedback from, pushback from their families after they transition. The other issue is really there is actually not one medical condition that doesn't have regrets.
Yeah.
I like to give the example of kidney transplants. We have a shortages of kidneys for transplantation in the United States, and there's a phenomenon of people who lose their kidneys. They get a transplant, and the reason they lose their kidney is because they have to be on immunosuppressant drugs
Right.
after they take it. Immunosuppressant drugs make life very uncomfortable. And so people don't like living on those drugs. So they stop taking it and they lose the kidney. So should we stop doing kidney transplants because those people have regrets about the procedure they went through? Of course not. What you want is more research, better evaluations, more education of patients about it. The opposite of shutting things down is more science, more research. And of course, we're seeing the politics are going in the opposite direction now.
Right. Yeah. So transgender people are facing staggering rates of bullying, of depression, suicide, even. What can the church, schools, families do to create a space where young people, no matter what their identity is, know that they are safe, loved, and not alone?
Again, we're out of my wheelhouse now because I'm just a doctor and I'm not a sociologist. I know, for example, the clinic in Amsterdam, which is a one of the first clinics to provide care, for kids with what we now call gender dysphoria. They have a very interesting approach. For example, they actually don't socially transition prepubescent children at all. They say, we don't know where the child is going to end up. So what they do is they wind up educating the child's social environment, the schools, presumably the churches as well, about, this is a child who's a little bit different than most children, and trying to increase tolerance for gender diversity.
Uh,
You know, so I grew up in Brooklyn, boys were supposed to be one way and girls are supposed to be another way, and if you crossed the line, you were subject to bullying,
right.
and but not everybody was a bully, and so all of us have the capacity for compassion. And if we lose the capacity for compassion, it demeans us ourselves. If we lose
Exactly.
our capacity for compassion, it makes us less of a person.
Yeah. Very good way to describe that, Doc. Um, I'd like to ask you, you mentioned something earlier, which I think it would be helpful if we could understand this better. Do you have, I'm sure you have a greater grasp of this, but what does a person who suffers from gender dysphoria, what is that feeling? Could you describe that a little more for our audience? I mean, you've had the
Yeah.
experience of talking.
Yeah. I can only approximate
No,
what
right,
gender dysphoria feels like because I've never had gender dysphoria myself. I recognize it when I see it in others, even though I don't feel it myself. And if I was trying to find a way so it's a feeling of one example is discomfort with my body. Okay. So the closest that most people might feel is, maybe I'm 20 pounds too heavy, that feeling of discomfort that
hmm,
I'm 20 pounds too heavy. So some people will lose weight. Some people will get liposuction. Some people will go on Ozempic. You know, different people will approach that. And some people will say, I don't care. Some people will buy bigger clothing. So there's a wide range of reactions to this feeling that there's something about my body that isn't quite right. And in some ways, the evolution of care for people who have gender dysphoria has been along those lines. Not everybody gets the whole shebang, for example.
Hmm.
Different people, like someone I can think of, in my practice, just got comfort from carrying, someone married to a woman with children, you know, found that carrying ladies' handbags, made them feel better.
Uh-huh.
That ability to express, a feminine gender was enough
Uh,
for their dysphoria.
uh-huh.
Some people that's not enough. Some people feel they want to take medication. They'd like to have their body changed. And some people want medication, but they don't want surgery or they can't afford surgery. Some people want surgery, but they don't want medication. So it's really about individualization. The complexity is so great that broad policy decisions banning all treatment really are, like not helpful.
Uh-huh.
And I would further add that even though we're talking about bans on children and adolescents, some of the states, once they began introducing bans for children and adolescents, also said, well, Medicaid is not going to pay for this, or Medicare is not
Right.
going to pay for this. So for adults as well.
Hmm.
So it's not really necessarily just about protecting children. Some aspect of it is really based in an actual animus towards people who are different than
Right.
them.
So part of this, I guess we wouldn't say the solution, but part of the process in someone being able to express uh, or feel comfortable in terms of gender dysphoria, maybe something as small as what you're saying is carrying a handbag or dressing up in the opposite gender in private
Yes.
for a while. Is this part of it is that there needs to be some way of expressing this?
Yes, it definitely feels for people, I have to do this. And some people will hide it.
So like losing 20 pounds and putting on skinny jeans
Yes. Exactly.
so that
Exactly.
I'm expressing it, I can feel it. Uh,
Right, because how many overweight people feel like there's a skinny person living inside them
right,
if they could
yeah,
only bring out the skinny person?
right, yeah,
So that's one way that,
uh-huh,
it's a metaphor, really. It's not
sure,
exactly the same
right,
because it's quite unique. That's the other thing I've learned in my years of trying to understand it. It's really quite unique. And most people, let me put it this way. There was a time in in America, let's say 1973, homosexuality was taken out of our psychiatry diagnostic manual. If you asked the people in a survey, what do you think about gay marriage? Most people, first of all, the question never appeared in the survey. And
uh-huh,
most people would say, what are you, crazy? And then the gay marriage issue 20 years later only came up in 1993 when the state of Hawaii first introduced the idea that gay marriage is constitutional there. And then suddenly you had a big conversation going on where everybody said, this is crazy. And a number of states passed constitutional amendments to ban gay marriage. But once that conversation started, then the extreme views sort of got, I don't know, marginalized as conversation about what does it really mean that
hmm,
these people want marriage. Today, 70% of Americans support gay marriage,
good,
even more than 50% of Republicans. So that all came about after a 30-year conversation.
right,
So the issue really is that we're at the beginning of that conversation. Most people, because polls show the more you know someone who's gay, the more likely you are, family member, relative, a coworker, a neighbor, the more likely you are to support gay rights. And not enough trans people right now are, out there. And right now they're being frightened to not come out
hmm,
because it's getting very scary to come
yeah,
out. But I think that will change with more conversation. I mean, I'm an optimist about the power of conversation.
uh-huh,
Otherwise, I wouldn't be a psychoanalyst.
right. And I think too that once you remember that this is a person with a father, a mother, siblings, friends, just like everybody else, I think that changes the perspective. Like you say, once I come to know someone or experience this, it changes my perspective. It
Ab-
personalizes the issue.
Absolutely. You want to humanize the
Exactly.
condition. Whereas what's going on now is a little bit of dehumanizing the condition. There's an attempt to say these are not people like everybody else. These people are a danger to the rest of us. That's a very worrisome thing to be happening,
Right.
not just for trans people, but for immigrants and
For
anybody.
anybody who, yeah.
Yeah.
No. So, in terms of our Franciscan tradition, how do we walk with transgender individuals? Franciscans are not judges or but as followers of Saint Francis, Francis embraced the leper, the outcast, anybody who suffered on the margins. Saint Francis went to those people. How would you see us as helping that?
Well, this is your flock.
Hmm.
I mean, these are the people who really could use assistance. Of course, you have the disadvantage of church doctrines which might be condemnatory of people like this. But I know from my own experience, I lived in Italy for 5 years as well, and I grew up with many Catholic. I grew up in Bensonhurst, we were a
I
mixture
am.
Italian neighborhood back
Hmm.
then. So, not everybody I know is condemnatory. And, I think that one-on-one relationships are always the most helpful.
Uh, so I think we go back to the fact that these are human beings like every other human being in the world, and that this is how we approach every human being
Absolutely.
with the dignity that God made them.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Doctor. I
Thank you for
appreciate you being
having
here.
me.
Thank you. Today's conversation has been challenging and maybe even uncomfortable in some ways, but often that's where the Holy Spirit is, where we wrestle with truth and we stretch our love more deeply. St. Francis didn't shy away from people others misunderstood or rejected. He knelt beside them. He called them brother or sister, and he saw Christ in every single face. So, how do we walk forward? Not with quick answers. As we saw with Dr. Drescher, there's so much information here that we need to understand it and speak to. But we need to walk with our hearts open to hearing the stories, not with fear, but with faith, and always, always, always with love. Whether you agree or disagree with what you've heard today, I thank you for staying at the table. That's how peace begins. I'm Father David, and this is Friar Time. If you or someone you know is seeking help or support, please visit PFLAG, a support group for families and allies. They have national and local chapters. That would be found at www.pflag.org. The Trevor Project works on preventing self-harm and suicide among LGBTQ plus youth at www.thetrevorproject.org. If you feel you need support, we'd ask you to please contact the website www.psychologytoday.com, a website that will help you find licensed therapists. Legal fights for LGBTQ plus rights are in the courts. That can be found at www.lambdalegal.org. The website for the American Psychiatric Association answers the question, what is gender dysphoria? At their website, www.psychiatry.org.